The day we moved into Magnolia Estates, the sun was shining, the air was clean, and my wife was already worried about whether her outfit was too much. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a cream blouse, simple flats, and a smile that lit up her whole face. "Do I look okay?" she asked as we pulled into the curved driveway of our new home. "You look like you own the place," I replied with a smirk. She chuckled but shook her head. "Let's not startle the neighbors." We had always been understated. My wife, Alina, never liked flaunting wealth. She preferred clean lines, quiet fabrics, nothing that screamed designer, even though she could have bought the entire luxury boutique. Which, to be fair, she once did. But in Magnolia Estates, she wanted to blend in, be normal, at least for a while. The community was pristine. Every lawn manicured like it had been cut with nail scissors. Houses lined up like they were posing for a real estate calendar. The HOA was infamously strict, but we figured as long as we kept a low profile, no one would bother us. That hope lasted all of 48 hours. Our first real interaction with the HOA came when Alina walked down to the mailbox by the entrance. Just a 5-minute stroll, nothing fancy. I was on the porch, sipping coffee, watching her go when I noticed a sleek, pearl-white Lexus roll up to the curb next to her. Out stepped a woman I would soon learn was Karen O'Halloran, but who already radiated Karen energy from the moment she opened her mouth. Blonde bob, pastel twin set, heels entirely unnecessary for suburban walking. She stood there, staring Alina up and down like she was inspecting expired fruit. From the porch, I could only hear snatches of the conversation, but I saw the moment Alina's polite smile froze. She nodded, said something short, then turned and walked back, a little stiffer than before. "What was that about?" I asked when she reached me. Alina took a breath, forcing a smile. She asked if I was here to apply for housekeeping, then told me, and I quote, "We like to keep a certain standard around here. Try not to loiter too close to the entrance. Residents get nervous." My coffee cup nearly shattered in my hand. "She thought you were." "She didn't think, she decided." Alina looked at me with a sad little grin. "Too plain to be a homeowner, I guess." I stared down the road where Karen's car had disappeared. I could feel the heat rising behind my eyes. Karen had just made the worst mistake of her HOA micromanaging life. Because the woman she'd insulted was the silent CEO of the very development company that built Magnolia Estates. And Karen had no idea the ground she was standing on literally belonged to Alina. The next morning, we found a pale yellow envelope tucked neatly into our mailbox. The return address was the Magnolia Estates Homeowners Association. I opened it with the same curiosity people reserve for bad Yelp reviews. Inside, in the most passive-aggressive font imaginable, was a formal warning about unapproved gatherings near the community entrance. Apparently, Alina's solo walk to the mailbox had been rebranded as a public disturbance. "She really filed a complaint," Alina said, eyebrows raised as she read over my shoulder. "About me standing at the mailbox for 2 minutes." "Welcome to Magnolia Estates," I muttered. "Population, tightly wound control freaks." Alina let out a soft laugh, but I could tell she wasn't amused. And it wasn't just the warning, it was the insult. The assumption that she couldn't possibly be a homeowner because of the way she dressed. As if kindness and humility somehow made her invisible. As if power always had to wear pearls and push people around. Karen's confidence was built on her belief that appearances defined value. That a plain, woman like Alina had no place in a neighborhood she considered her personal kingdom. But what Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that the very streets she strutted on, the lampposts she micromanaged, the park benches she claimed needed repainting in approved colors. All of it was part of Alina's portfolio. Years ago, Alina had quietly bought out a major stake in Arborstone Developments, the very company that built Magnolia Estates from the dirt up. And when the original developers moved on, she stepped in as the controlling owner. Her name was kept out of public filings by choice for privacy and peace. She didn't need credit. She had vision. But now, that piece had been poked one too many times. Still, Alina wasn't the type to explode or make scenes. No, she was quieter than that. Smarter. More dangerous in that gentle way people never see coming until it's too late. "I think I'll attend the next HOA meeting," she said casually, sipping her tea. "See what kind of standards they're working with." "You sure?" I asked. She smiled. "Oh, I won't say a word, just want to see the room." And that was the moment I knew. Karen had kicked the wrong hornet's nest. And the queen had just started to buzz. The next HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. It was a sterile room with fluorescent lighting, cheap folding chairs, and a faint smell of lemon-scented furniture polish, perfect for the kind of suburban power games Karen thrived on. We arrived 5 minutes early. Alina wore her usual dark slacks, a navy sweater, and her hair in a simple ponytail. She looked effortlessly elegant, but still the same plain woman Karen had dismissed. No jewelry, no designer handbag, just a calm, steady presence. Karen was already there, presiding over the setup like a dictator preparing for a state banquet. She was stacking papers, adjusting nameplates, and barking polite commands at two nervous volunteers arranging cookies. She didn't notice us until we sat down in the front row. Her expression shifted fast, polite confusion sliding into barely masked condescension. "Oh, hello again," she said, as if we were stray pets that had wandered in. "I didn't expect to see you at these meetings. Usually it's the property owners who attend." Alina just smiled. "Oh, I thought it might be nice to see how the neighborhood is being managed." Karen gave a tight, patronizing laugh. "Well, I hope you find it enlightening. Some of us have been keeping things in order here for years." The meeting began, and Karen slid right into her element, issuing citations, assigning garden standards, and declaring war on someone. Excessively colored patio umbrella. She made it sound like a national security threat. It was all very serious to her, even if everyone else in the room looked like they'd rather be watching paint dry. Then, mid-meeting, she pulled out a new agenda item. "I'd like to propose a revised dress code for communal areas," she said, her eyes darting, no, aiming, at Alina. "Something that reflects the elegance of our community. We want to make sure appearances match the prestige of Magnolia Estates." Alina didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, quietly listening. "Perhaps we could distribute guidelines," Karen continued, now on a roll. "Examples of appropriate attire for walks, social gatherings, and mailbox areas. After all, image is everything." There was a murmur in the room, part discomfort, part disbelief. Even the cookie-arranging volunteers looked up in confusion. Alina leaned over to me and whispered, "I think I've seen enough." And with that, she stood up. Karen paused mid-sentence, clearly thrown off. "Is something wrong?" "No," Alina said softly, tucking her chair in. "I'll just be reviewing this meeting in more detail later. I'm sure the development board will find it informative." Karen blinked. "Development board." Alina gave her a polite smile, then walked out without another word. Karen stared after her, trying to process what had just happened, but the seed had been planted. And Karen had no idea she was standing in soil owned by the very woman she just tried to dress code into silence. By the next morning, the air in Magnolia Estates was thick with curiosity. Alina's quiet exit from the HOA meeting had stirred something, especially with that cryptic reference to the development board. People began to whisper, speculate. Karen, on the other hand, was scrambling for information like a raccoon in a trash bin. She must have made a dozen calls. First to the HOA secretary, then to the property management office, and finally to the original Arborstone Developments hotline, which had been redirected, unknowingly, to Alina's office team 2 years ago. From what I gathered later, Karen had asked, in her overly sweet voice, if she could speak to whoever was in charge of property expansion and community standards. She was politely told that Mrs. Alina Hartwell, the principal investor and majority owner of the Magnolia Estates development, was reviewing HOA communications personally. The phone call reportedly ended in stunned silence. That afternoon, Karen didn't come outside. Her daily dog-walking routine was suddenly canceled. No Lexus sightings, no clipboard patrols. The Karen storm had gone eerily quiet. Meanwhile, Alina was busy, not with vengeance, but with logistics. She requested a full breakdown of HOA actions over the last 3 years. Every fine, every complaint, every change in policy. And what she found was worse than we imagined. Karen hadn't just been a nuisance. She'd weaponized the HOA. There were patterns of targeted warnings, particularly against residents who didn't fit her aesthetic standards. One retiree had even been fined for decorative garden gnomes that clash with the neighborhood's visual harmony. Visual harmony, Alina repeated with a smirk, holding the letter like it was a crime scene photo. She met with her legal team the next day, not to sue, but to prepare a motion to restructure the HOA's oversight committee. As the majority property owner, she had every right to review the board, amend the bylaws, and appoint new leadership if existing members were found to be acting in bad faith or damaging community relations. Karen wasn't just about to be challenged. She was about to be audited. But Alina didn't move in anger. Everything she did was precise, deliberate, and entirely above board. No grand speeches, no mic drops. Just quiet paperwork, a few calls, and a growing awareness that the woman Karen once dismissed as too plain was, in fact, her new boss. And she was about to find that out, in the most humbling way imaginable. The beauty of Alina's plan was in its grace. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, just a slow, elegant tightening of the reins. First came the internal HOA audit. Alina, through the development board's authority, requested a formal review of all past citations, particularly those issued under Karen's presidency. Within days, HOA members began receiving polite emails asking for clarification on their voting histories, citation processes, and neighborhood complaints. Karen's allies, few as they were, started to distance themselves. No one wanted to be caught in the fallout. Then came the announcement. A neatly formatted letter, printed on premium stock, was hand-delivered to every home in Magnolia Estates. It introduced Alina Hartwell as the primary stakeholder of the Magnolia Estates development portfolio and outlined a scheduled community vision forum hosted by the board. The letter was warm, respectful, and disarmingly simple. Karen, of course, had a meltdown. She called an emergency meeting, tried to rally the remaining board members to counter the corporate intrusion, and even drafted a rebuttal flyer. But by now, the tide had turned. People had experienced enough of her micromanagement. The neighborhood was ready for a reset, and Alina, with her quiet grace and long game, had offered exactly that. The day of the forum arrived. It was held in the same clubhouse where Karen once reigned. But this time the room had changed. Soft music played, fresh coffee and pastries were laid out, and the atmosphere was welcoming, not hostile. Elena stood at the front, not at a podium, but beside a table like she was hosting a relaxed conversation. She wore the same understated style as always, no labels, no pretense, and she began with a story. "I moved here for the peace," she said, "for the trees, the quiet, and the sense of community. I didn't expect to be reminded that, even in places built with care, it's easy to lose sight of kindness." She never said Karen's name. She didn't have to. "I've been part of this neighborhood longer than most people realize. And it's time we remember what makes a neighborhood worth living in. It's not the dress codes. It's not the roses cut just so. It's the people." Applause followed, not thunderous but genuine. Karen sat stiffly in the third row, lips pursed so tightly they could have sliced glass. Her usual air of superiority had deflated into a silent, simmering panic. The room wasn't hers anymore. The HOA wasn't hers anymore. And the biggest twist, Elena still hadn't mentioned her title. That would come the next day. With documents, illegal ones, signed, sealed, and carrying the weight of ownership. The next morning, every mailbox in Magnolia Estates received another envelope. This one was HOA issued, and it wasn't printed on the cheap stuff. It was thick, embossed, and bore the elegant crest of Arborstone Developments. Inside was a formal statement from the company's board, authored and signed by Elena Hartwell, majority owner and principal executive. The letter was short, sharp, and entirely professional. It announced a structural reorganization of the Magnolia Estates Homeowners Association in partnership with Arborstone's Development Oversight Committee. Effective immediately, the HOA board would be placed under review, and interim leadership would be appointed to ensure fair and inclusive governance. Karen's name was not among those retained. It was like a controlled detonation, quiet, clean, and devastating. Within an hour, the neighborhood group chat lit up like a Christmas tree. Screenshots of the letter flooded the chat. Messages ranged from "holy crap, Elena owns the entire development," to "I knew she had power, but not that kind of power." One of the best was, "She's been strolling around like a queen in disguise this whole time." Karen, nowhere to be seen. Her Lexus sat in the driveway like a sulking child on timeout. But Elena, she was on the porch, reading with a cup of coffee like it was any other Tuesday. A few neighbors walked by, nodding with a new kind of respect, one earned not by dominance but by restraint. The real show, though, was later that afternoon. A landscaping crew arrived at Karen's house, asterisk not asterisk at her request. They began measuring her beloved front hedge, the same one she'd cited others over for being an inch too wild. Turns out, her own hedge was technically in violation. An Arborstone compliance officer accompanied the team, clipboard in hand, documenting the findings. Karen finally emerged, mouth tight, robe wrapped a little too tightly around her like it could shield her from reality. "Well, this is a mistake," she snapped. "No, ma'am," the officer replied calmly. "This is standard compliance, just like the policies you enforced." She tried to argue, of course, sputtering about favoritism and retaliation. But the irony was delicious. Every standard she had ruthlessly enforced was now being applied to her, publicly and legally. By sunset, Karen had received her very first official violation. She didn't wave at anyone that evening. But the rest of us, we toasted on our porch, me, Elena, and a few neighbors who had once stayed quiet under Karen's thumb. Because the plain woman she underestimated had rewritten the rule book. And now everyone was finally playing fair. Karen's humiliation unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck, one where the passengers were sipping champagne while she frantically pulled the emergency brake. She tried, briefly, to rally support by sending a furious email to the HOA mailing list, calling the restructuring a corporate coup and warning of dangerous changes coming to the community. No one replied. Well, except one neighbor, who simply responded with a photo of Karen's now-trimmed hedge and the caption, "Standards." The silence from her usual circle was deafening. The same people who once followed her lead now smiled politely at Elena during neighborhood walks. They waved. They asked about the next community forum. Someone even offered to bring snacks. It was like the neighborhood had collectively shed a layer of Karen-induced anxiety and started breathing easier. Karen, on the other hand, retreated. She stopped attending meetings altogether. Her once daily patrols ceased. Her pastel blazers stopped showing up at mailbox gatherings. She was no longer feared or respected, just tolerated like an outdated lawn gnome someone forgot to move. The best part? Elena never gloated, not once. She remained gracious and warm the way she had always been. When she hosted a small community brunch the following weekend, she personally invited everyone, including Karen. Karen didn't show. But the party was a hit. Lawn chairs, finger foods, lemonade stands run by kids. It felt like a real neighborhood again. People laughed, shared stories, complimented Elena's garden. For the first time, Magnolia Estates felt human. That same afternoon, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's front lawn. Subtle, tucked near the bushes, but it was there. Rumors swirled. Some said she couldn't stand living under someone else's authority. Others thought she just couldn't handle the shame. Either way, the message was clear. She was done. Elena passed her house during a walk and paused briefly. Karen was inside, peeking out through the blinds like a ghost trapped in the house she once ruled. Their eyes met for a second. Karen looked away first. Elena didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Because the truth was simple. The plain woman had dismantled the queen bee's hive, with grace, power, and just the right amount of irony. And the queen. She never saw it coming. Weeks passed, and peace returned to Magnolia Estates, not just on the surface, but in that real, deep-down way you feel when something toxic has finally been cleared out. Kids played on the sidewalks again. Neighbors lingered longer during walks. The community felt more alive, more free. Karen's house sold faster than expected, though at a slight loss, given the number of concerns raised during inspection. Apparently, the gazebo she'd bragged about for years had been built without proper permits. The new buyers were a young couple who moved in with a rescue dog and a grill. Within 2 days, they were hosting backyard barbecues and blasting classic rock. No one complained, not even a little. Elena's role remained subtle, yet her presence carried a quiet authority now. She never claimed credit for saving the neighborhood. She just kept showing up. At meetings, at events, at the mailbox, wearing the same comfortable clothes Karen once mocked, now greeted with warm smiles and waves. The HOA board, fully restructured, fair, balanced, and led by people who actually cared about the community, not controlling it. Elena declined any formal position. She said she preferred to stay behind the curtain, which only made people respect her more. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch light flickered on, Elena sat beside me on our swing, a glass of iced tea in her hand and a sketch pad in her lap. The pages were filled with drawings of the neighborhood, kids on bikes, flower beds blooming, someone walking a corgi in a sweater. She looked content, peaceful. "I don't think she'll ever really understand what happened," she said quietly. "She didn't need to," I replied. "The neighborhood did." Elena smiled, a little mischievous glint in her eyes. "Do you think she tells people she was forced out by some big-shot developer?" I laughed, only if she can handle saying it was the plain woman she thought didn't belong. We clinked glasses, and as we sat there, porch bathed in golden light, the neighborhood alive around us, it was clear. Elena hadn't just reclaimed her dignity. She'd restored balance to a place that had forgotten what community meant. Karen left behind nothing but faded paint and a for sale listing. Elena, she left a legacy, all without ever raising her voice or her wardrobe budget. And that, my friend, is how the plain woman came, saw, and classily conquered.